Okay, Andy, are you ready?
Yeah, it's about 7 o'clock. I think we'll
Yeah,
go
it's
ahead
a
and
little
get started.
fast, a little fast, yeah. Um, I guess we'll go ahead and start this evening. Again, I want to thank you for being on um, this this portion of the Spring Online Beef Cattle Production Management Workshop Series, second night here. Um, my name is Patrick Davis, MU Extension Livestock Field Specialist in Stockton. We have Andy McCorkill on tonight. He's a MU Extension Livestock Field Specialist in the Buffalo area, and he's going to discuss spring management of the cow herd. And so, again, before we start, like I said, I want to thank you for being on. Let's try to keep our mics muted, cut down on the noise. If you have any questions, the chat box, that's probably the best way to ask questions. We may stop periodically throughout. If anybody's got a question, we can, or you can unmute and ask the question, but probably it's just easier if we keep everything muted so we don't have any background noise or other noise. So, like I said, tonight's presentation, I've got it recording now, and I'll put together, I'll convert it to a YouTube video hopefully tomorrow and send out that link. I did send some information ahead of time to you. Some of the stuff Andy's going to go over tonight in this presentation. One of the documents was in a link, and then the others I was able to copy, or I was able to attach them to the email. So if you have any questions or anything, or need anything else, just let us know. And like I said, probably the best way to ask questions is through the chat box down there. It's on my screen, it's near the bottom, but it's one of the boxes. So with that, Andy, I think I'll give you the floor, and you can get on with our presentation tonight about spring management of the cow herd.
Just starting off, I would encourage you to, in your spare time, look up the extension publication that I had Patrick sent the link for anyway. It's basically fresh off the press from last fall anyway, and it's accumulation of several kind of beef reproduction related guide sheets all into one nice book, and you can look at them individually, or you can order the book and buy and have a paper copy of it if you like as well there anyway. And this is one of those things that we're hitting things kind of from the 9,000 foot view tonight anyway. And if you have any more questions or something later on, well, you can get a hold of Patrick or I, whichever one's closer to you, and we'll be glad to work with you more on an individualized basis on kind of working through some situations on your particular farm as well. Okay, so kind of this is what we're going to talk about kind of in brief tonight anyway. We're going to hit on nutrition because nutrition is an important factor of all sorts of production when it comes to the beef cow calf operation anyway. And so we're going to hit on it a whole lot actually, in fact. And then we're going to kind of graze over the reproduction aspects just a little bit, and then finish up thinking about heifer development a little bit as well there tonight anyway. Kind of hit from there. So basically, as I said, nutrition is the glue that holds everything together. Probably some of you have said in some sort of an animal science class, whether it be in a high school ag class or even through college for that matter, where you've talked about ration balancing a little bit, and that's a pretty important aspect of what we do when we think about nutrition. Is basically what we're doing is we're matching what our animals' needs up with what we have to meet those needs, and trying to do it as cheaply as what we possibly can. So generally speaking, here in Southwest Missouri, forage is where we generally look to first. That tends to be the one that tends to be the cheapest for us most of the time anyway. And so we look at it as being the one that we look to first most generally anyway. And then the rest of those, the grains and oil seed meals and byproducts, we kind of we kind of use those to balance out those protein and energy needs where we might have a little bit of deficiency along the way there. And then last but not least, we've got our vitamins and minerals, which are certainly important, but we need those in rather small quantities, and they tend to be costly when we have to buy them from outside sources. And so we tend to kind of look to them last for the most part anyway. But basically we've got a protein and energy. Of course, those are the two biggest ones that we think about as far as meeting the needs, the ones that we tend to, one or the other, we tend to be deficient in first. And then we've got our fats, vitamins, and minerals are the other things. But what it really comes down to is we meet those needs so that on the backside, why we can keep things with, we have to have that to be able to keep our cows in shape to where they can be good employees for us. Basically, we need to look at our cows as employees, and they can do their job for us, which is raise a calf every 365 days and make it be an adequate one. What does it take to do that? It takes milk, and it takes nutrients to be able to produce adequate milk for her to be able to pass that on to the calf. And then ultimately, why we need to think about things from the end of the chain there, when we see that picture of that nice T-bone steak on there. And what happens when we get out of whack? Why we get kind of sickly, poor doing looking calves like what you see here on the side anyway, which is absolutely not what we're looking for there anyway. And so we want to try and do what we can to keep from getting into that point. Hey, what we've got in front of us here, this is a nutritional requirement chart for a 1,000-pound cow. Now, I don't see too many actual faces out here to truly ask this question like what I generally do, but generally speaking, the answer is that I get is not very many people have 1,000-pound cows anymore. But when we think about 1,000 pounds, well, that's a good round number to use for calculation purposes, and then we can go up from there as we need to anyway. And keep in mind the percentage columns that will hold true regardless of the size of the animal. The percentage where we've got the percentage of protein and the percent of TDN, which TDN is kind of a good one-stop number for us. We use that to estimate the energy content of feedstuffs. It stands for total digestible nutrients is what that stands for. And so like I say, when you look at things from the protein or from the percentage standpoint, why this will hold true regardless of the cow side, but as those cows get bigger, why that percentage of their actual dry matter intake is going to go up because it takes more to feed them. And so we keep that in mind. We've got several things to talk about on this chart here. Actually, we've actually got the amount of dry matter that they're going to take. If you notice that as we get up closer to pregnancy and then actually in lactation there too, for that matter, why the amount that they actually have to eat goes up a little bit as they go through the production cycle like that anyway, and as do their requirements. The protein requirement, it goes up considerably anyway, not quite double, but close to it, from being a dry cow in the mid-third, basically one that we just weaned the calf off of, up to being one that's a really heavy milker type there anyway. And so, like I say, the stage of production really has a big role in what our nutritional requirements are at any given point. And so that's one of the reasons that we try and kind of encourage you to test your forages that you've got in front of us and save the best for when they need it the most, is what we kind of talk about doing there anyway. If you look on the TDN side, again, you notice a really marked increase in the amount of energy that those animals require as we go through the production chain from being a dry cow that we've pulled the calf off of and has no lactation in the equation up here to one that's in the peak of her lactation. And so, like I say, that's some of the things that we need to think about. And then you look at this 2-year-old, this first calf heifer that's just got her first calf at side down there. She's got a lot of things going on in her life that make her requirements be just a touch higher. Besides trying to figure out how to be a mama for the first time and raise that calf and produce milk for her, she's also still trying to grow and get healed up from that calf as well there anyway. And so we've got to take a little bit better care of her than what we would our older, more mature cows too. And so keep that in mind. And that's another one of those things we generally recommend that you keep those first calf heifers together in a group where you can give them a little bit of extra TLC, certainly up through calving and preferably through their breeding season to go back to be bred back for that second calf even. Okay, so of those that we talked about, the protein and energy and all, energy is the one that tends to be the first limiting nutrient that we tend to run into in our environment around here. We talk about protein an awful lot. Predominantly, it goes back to solving those Pearson squares in ag classes in high school and college too, for that matter anyway. And And it's honestly, it's the first ingredient that's labeled, or first nutrient that's labeled on feed tags as well anyway. And so we talk about protein an awful lot, but in reality, in our environment here in Southwest Missouri, where we run predominantly on cool season grass type of forages anyway, why we tend to be okay on protein for the most part. And we'll talk about that in another slide or two here anyway. But energy is where we really need to put more focus on. And you see, we've got several different pictures of energy sources through here. And of course, when we think about meeting those nutrients, well, we're always going to look to forage first here in Southwest Missouri, where we're fortunate to be able to have good standing forage out in front of those animals for 10, maybe even 11 months out of the year, if you manage things properly anyway. And so we're always going to look to that forage, what you see over there on the far right, to meet those needs first. And then of course, hay, that's our dried forage there. Now, this year it might not be quite so much cheaper than what some of the rest of these are when we look at it on a nutrient basis, because of the cost of our 3 F's, the feed, fuel, and fertilizer type of thing, why things are going to be different and be a little bit tighter this year anyway. And so, of course, we've got a lot of fuel and a lot of fertilizer costs that go into producing that hay. And so it's going to make it a more expensive feed stuff than normal this year, I think, anyway. And then, of course, we've got our good old number 2 yellow corn over here. That's kind of the old standby for energy sources. And then you see down here, we've got some byproduct here. That's distiller's grain anyway. Those have really, really helped out a lot with keeping our feed costs down over the last 15 years or so, as they've become more predominant anyway. And distiller's grain is a wonderful source of both protein and energy for us to use. That's really pretty comparable to other things in price when we look at it on a nutrient basis. And then you notice this other picture here, it's got some candy mixed in there, and I put that in there kind of for humor as much as anything. But actually, in all honesty, why I do deal with some folks from time to time that have the capability of buying large semi-lot loads of different commodities that wind up getting some call candy from, and other sorts of products like that from different sources anyway. And there's certainly nothing wrong with that if you can get a good deal on it. You look, this is basically sugar, though, these little like gummy type of candies that you see there anyway. Another one that I've dealt with quite a bit is called peanuts that have come in mixed in with a commodity mix anyway that work out to be a pretty decent addition to a ration but you got to know how to utilize those things as well anyway, and kind of be somewhat cautious about them. But you can most generally put at least 10% of those in without having to be too awful cautious about things anyway. Okay, so let's talk about some of those additional factors that affect the energy requirements of our animals. We kind of mentioned this a slide or two back anyway, that as those animals get bigger, why it takes more energy to be able to get their maintenance requirements met there anyway. And that's kind of what this chart here shows us. If you look, the blue bar, the bottom one here, that's for a 1,000-pound cow is what we're talking about there. And basically across the bottom of our chart here, you see months since calving. So this would be basically at calving here, and then so on and so forth out to when she calves the next time over here on the far side here. And then actually her net energy for maintenance requirement per day on the left-hand side here anyway. So if you notice, basically when we go from a 1,000-pound cow to a 1,200-pound cow, we add about 10% to her energy requirements or maintenance energy requirements, and then going on up to that 1,400-pound cow, why we add another 10% to that essentially there is what we do. And so size does matter, and I understand that there's kind of a fine line there anyway between having too small and too big. And I don't personally advocate for everybody needing to have 1,000-pound cows, because we have to have cows that have the genetic propensity to be able to produce a calf that's going to grow and be adequate for our commercial market as well, unless you're going to get into some sort of a niche market. And generally speaking, that's going to take a cow that's in that 12 to 1,300 pound range as a general rule, as a minimum anyway. And 14 is kind of still in acceptable territory, but we go to getting above that, and those animals do tend to go to eating more than what they can produce out in pounds of calf at the end of the day anyway there. And so that's something to kind of work on over time with your herd, is kind of trying to find that optimal for you anyway. And I think we're kind of in an environment here where we're able to abundantly grow a lot of forage like what we do, where we can kind of push that envelope on cow size a little bit. But again, you go to getting those cows that are too big, and it just the ratio between their size and the size of calf that they wean off just doesn't hold up a lot of times anyway. And so they tend to be a little bit less profitable, even though they might raise a nice big calf for you. Okay, so we talked about that 12 to 1,400 pound range there. We're going to split the difference and focus on a 1,300 pound cow here for just a minute here. If you notice, we've got different colors on our bars here. And again, we've got across the bottom, we've got months since calving, basically all the way from calving up until when she calves next year in here anyway. And the same energy requirement setting here anyway. But what I really want you to focus on here is the different how that energy that they intake is partitioned into different needs. So maintenance obviously takes up the biggest portion of that. The most of the energy that they intake goes toward actually maintaining what they've got in front of them there, what's their cow size, maintaining bodily functions for us there anyway. And then we've got this kind of reddish orange color here. That's lactation is what that is anyway. So milk production. And if you look here, we get out here to the peak of lactation here from basically in the first 2 months or so to 3 months of that calf's life anyway. Well, we're right there at the peak of her energy requirements. And so it's not a bad idea to think about trying to kind of mesh your cow's energy requirements right along with the forage availability that we have out there in front of us anyway. And so kind of keep that in mind. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later on when it comes to setting up your calving and breeding seasons there and finding an ideal window for you. Like I say, we'll talk about that a little bit more later on, but you can really kind of cut down on those costs if you can get things set up to where they can do as much as they can on the grass and you don't have to put as much supplement to them there anyway. Then we go to looking out here. If you notice this gray bar, the gray at the top of the bar there anyway, that's the pregnancy. So basically we don't have any here, but then we start the breeding season out here 90 days, give or take from when that calf is born. And so hopefully she's got a calf developing at that point. And although you can't see it very clearly, while you start seeing the little gray at the top of the bar out through here. And then we get out here, and what happens at about 7 or 8 months, it just makes that cow's energy requirement go to nothing. We take lactation out of the equation there. And so basically that's weaning the calf off is what we're doing out there. And of course, 205 days of age is the magical research used number most of the time anyway, which equates out to about 7 months of age there anyway. And so, like I say, we take that milk production out of the equation and we drop her energy requirements to nothing. And that's one of those things that you can kind of utilize as a management tool. When times are lean, you can wean those calves just a little bit early to be able to knock her energy requirements down and cut back on the overall feed stuff that we have to put in front of that herd. And at the same time, if we've got quite a little bit of feed in front of us, we can leave that cow on there a little bit longer as well anyway. So like I say, that's one of those things you can kind of think about and play with from a management standpoint if you need to go along there. Okay, so let's talk about genetics and how that plays into energy requirements here for just a second. And I understand this is some old data. This is actually from NRC that was published in 2000. But the thing we got to remember here is there's more variance within a breed than there is among the breeds, really. Anyway, there are very efficient animals within each, but this is what the breed trends tend to be from research and what they've determined there anyway. So if you look, we've got a maintenance multiplier of 1 on our British animals up there. That'd be like a good old F1 Angus Hereford cross cow there anyway. So that's our baseline animal there is what we're talking about. And then we go down, we look at that dairy influenced animal, the Holstein Jersey type. Basically, we add 20% to their energy requirement just by adding that dairy influence to the equation there. And so I understand that across southern Missouri, a lot of the beef herds started out as dairy herds, and then when the dairy economy kind of tanked, why they started breeding to the beef bulls and breeding that dairy influence out. But so, and it does have its place, but that's not something that we really want to shoot for there either anyway. And then we get down in here to our continental breeds. We look at Limousine and Charolais, those that are really developed more for producing large quantities of good lean mass and kind of more terminal type of animals there. Why they're basically right on target with what our British animals are on as far as energy requirements go. We get down into these here, the more kind of maternally minded ones, the Gelbvieh, Simmental, and all anyway, and we need to add 10 to 20% for them, because partly because they're a larger animal or tend to be a larger animal, and also besides that, why they tend to be pretty heavy milkers as well. You know, all three of these breeds in the old country hundreds of years ago, they initially started out as dual purpose breeds anyway, and so like I say, the milk production is kind of at the root of that there. Then we get to the bottom of the chart here. We think about those Boss Industries cattle, and where are the Brahman influenced cattle really bred to thrive? Environments where they have to walk 20 miles between hoof prints to get a drink of water, right? And so feed stuff can really be scarce in that environment where they really come from. And so they have to be more efficient to be able to survive in that anyway. And so basically, if purebred Brahman animals, we can take 10% off of their energy requirements, and the half bloods, the Brangus, the Brayford, those like that, we can take about 5% off of what our baseline is for them anyway. And so, like I say, you might want to kind of keep that in mind. And granted, there is a lot of variance when we look at individuals there on that anyway, but that can give you some direction in where you might want to go with your breeding program as well. Okay, let's talk about cold stress. Now, the last several days, we haven't had to deal with cold stress too much, but as my dad would always say, March is the coldest month of winter a lot of times anyway, and certainly we're seeing that right now. We've seen a whole lot colder days, but that kind of cool, damp air and being used to the heat, that it can really cause us some trouble anyway this time of year. But we've got what's called the critical temperature, which is the point at which our livestock they go to being cold stressed anyway. We've got what we call the thermal neutral zone, where they're neither heat stressed or cold stressed, and that critical temperature is where we get down to that point where they've started to feel the effects of cold stress. And if you notice, there's more than one factor really that goes into that. We look at the hair coat, of course, to start with, besides the temperature that's outside anyway, and we've got to think about that. Probably some of you have some cows, probably that are starting to shed a little bit right now anyway, and so that certainly plays a role in how cold weather that they can tolerate. And same way with the fall, for that matter anyway, where they haven't gotten that full heavy winter coat on anyway. They can't take quite as cold weather before they start to really feeling the stress there a little bit anyway. But then we look at these down here toward the bottom of the chart there. You know, if we've got a good heavy winter coat in dry conditions, why, we can get down below 20 degrees without ever really seeing any cold stress out of them anyway. And so that's, like I say, certainly comes into play there. The hair coat does. And besides that, the moisture in the air. Again, you know, one of the hardest things on animals is like this time of year where we've got a lot of mud under their feet, and then we can get those kind of cold rains from above. And as I said earlier, that hair coat tends to start shedding as well anyway. And so we can really start seeing some of these stresses above 45 degrees in some instances, to be honest with you even. And the thing to kind of remember is, for every degree below this critical temperature that we see here anyway, why their energy requirement goes up about 1%. And so that's some of those situations where we kind of need to think about supplementing a lot of times. And there's an old saying that I've heard some old timers say: January shakes them, February breaks them, and March takes them. And that's kind of what that comes down to is, you know, they've been shook up by the cold of January and February, and March, a lot of times after having 2 months of pulling out of the fat reserves they have in their body for energy, why they're kind of weak anyway, and then a little bit shorter grass when they want to be picking up more grass and everything anyway, really kind of can really do them in if we aren't careful. March can be one of the hardest months of the winter to get animals through. Okay, so let's talk about the other side of the equation here, heat stress, for just a second. And probably some of our animals that haven't started shedding were experiencing a little bit of heat stress when we saw those days last week where we were getting up near 80 degrees and in the last few days of February and first few of March there anyway. And so we've got to think about heat stress, and we think about going into spring and certainly the summer as well. And although there isn't as much research work that's been done on that, because animals that are heat stressed, they tend to keel over on us a whole lot quicker than those that are cold stressed, and so we can't do a whole lot of good research on them. But we can kind of get an idea of how we're doing there by how their breathing rate goes anyway. And so if you see that really kind of rapid, shallow breathing where they're breathing really fast and kind of shallow breaths like that, why, that can be up toward 10% increase in energy requirement for those. And then those where we've a lot of times had animal handling failures, where we've had to run animals a little bit more in the heat of the summer, where where they're really breathing deep and their mouth is wide open and their tongue hanging out there, why we can potentially see increases in 25% in their energy requirement, and that just specifically by the respiration rate has to the increase in energy that's burned up by that anyway. And so keep that in mind and try and keep some shade for your animals when they need it the most through the later spring and summer months for certain anyway. And don't stress those animals just any more than what we just have to. Okay, so let's switch gears here for just a second and we'll talk about protein. As I said earlier on, we tend to do okay on protein in our fescue environment for the most part. There are some times when that isn't completely true. If we've got some of those, when we think about the cow herd, if we've got some of those really heavier milking type of cows, their protein requirements, if you remember, they can be up 12% or a little over there anyway, where that can be above what we've got in quality and some of that over mature type of fescue that we see a lot of times, and certainly a lot of what our fescue hay is anyway. We'll look at the protein content here in just in a slide or two anyway. Where things really lag behind, and again, I talked about protein and how come we focus on protein so much earlier on anyway, but out in the western states where they tend to be deficient in protein as those warm season grasses go to get more mature, and then certainly through the dormant season, they don't hold their feed value like what our fescue can through the winter time. And so we've got to really watch those. And if you are in a more warm season type of environment, which, like I say, that's more to the west of us where they have to worry about the protein in a bigger way than what we do anyway. For this slide here, actually, I got this information from one of Patrick and mine coworkers, Gene Smits, and I submit some hay samples to him, but Gene has collected feed values data from forage samples, basically for the last 20 years or so, or almost anyway, 15 for certain anyway. And like I say, I've submitted some samples to help increase the size of the database, and I'm sure Patrick has too. But this, looking over time here, we notice there's a lot of variability in the top end of the protein quality and the bottom somewhat anyway. But if you notice our average still, it tends to year in and year out stay pretty close to that 10% range on where our protein, actual protein of the hay that we actually see tests on when we look at that fescue hay is anyway. And so, like I say, we're not in a horribly bad place for protein. We can be deficient on those cows that are in lactation, as I said earlier, but it's not something that we can overcome fairly easily with a little bit of supplementation either, though, anyway. And obviously, you'd rather be a little bit on the higher side, of course, than that anyway. And that comes down a lot of times to the weather and how that stuff is managed anyway. And if we can get in on that stuff and harvest it for hay earlier on, the old saying that good hay needs to be made in May is absolutely right. If we can get in there in the first few weeks of May, or perhaps even the last few of April, in some instances anyway, why we're going to have a whole lot better feed quality. And so we can kind of cut back on the supplement from that standpoint as well. If you look on the bottom side here, again, we get down here to some pretty poor stuff, and that would probably be, that's primarily going to be after seed, late harvested type of crop is what that's going to be, where we get down here in the 5, 6, 7% protein range. And when we go to getting below 7% protein, why we really go to getting into trouble. It takes a minimum of 7% really to be able to kind of keep the microbial functions of the rumen surviving anyway. And so if we go to getting below 7, we definitely need to be thinking about putting some protein supplement to them. But as I said, that's with a little bit of proper management, why protein isn't a horrible deal for us to overcome a lot of times. Okay, so let's talk about some kind of simple ways to evaluate that energy status that we talked about there earlier on, nutrients in general for that matter anyway. On the left here, we've got a cow that's marked up body condition scoring. We'll talk about that more in a few slides here. But basically, the body condition scoring system is a way to evaluate the fat cover on an animal. And when we talk about beef cows, we primarily use a 9-point scale, with a 1 being a very thin cow and a 9 being a severely obese cow. And I'll show you some pictures here in the next couple of slides anyway to kind of go along with that. But basically, we look at the fat cover over the backbone and the ribs and through the hip areas, and then finally down here through the brisket area and kind of over the shoulder there anyways. And we're kind of looking to evaluate how much fat there is there anyway. And the bottom line is, we really don't want to get to where we see more than a faint outline of the last rib or two. And if what we're wanting to kind of shoot for there. Another good tool that we can kind of utilize that doesn't cost us a thing is to look at the manure that's coming out of the back end of those animals. And this picture, the manure that's in this picture here, that's not really what we want to see. Notice how it's clumped up pretty tight, and you see the little rings forming there anyway. That's an indication that we're really shy on both protein and energy, and for that matter anyway. And in that particular one, as the manure really stacks up, and like I say, you see those kind of rings forming in the manure piles like that. That's an indicator that we're not doing what we need to do from a nutritional standpoint. And so we need to kind of up the game there. And then lastly, this is a picture I took of one of our coworkers, Jill Scheid, who's an agronomy specialist, and we were at a grazing school and talking about forage evaluation, and she was teaching on the subject there. But basically, all that takes is going out and kind of walking through your fields and having a look at things and kind of seeing how they are from a maturity standpoint, and just how much you've got out there. About 75% of the equation when we talk about cow nutrition is actually having the feedstuffs out there for them to eat. And the other 25% is the quality side of the equation anyway. And so, like I say, having a good idea of how much you've got out there, and then even kind of judging how and the coarser that stuff feels, the less palatable it's going to be, and the slower to digest, and so they're not going to get as much energy out of it anyway. So, like I say, you can take a look at that forage and get an idea of how you're doing there as well. Okay, so we kind of talked about this body condition already, and this is more or less the same thing that we've already talked about. And again, talking about where the fat cover and how to kind of evaluate that anyway. And again, as you see here, this particular cow where you can see these hip bones, and she doesn't have any fat over her tail head there anyway. That's kind of where the bottom end of where we really want to be right there. Okay, so this is a 1 score and a 9 score on the body condition score scale. And again, I can't see many of your faces here tonight anyway, but I hope that you don't have a whole herd full of body condition score 1 cows at home. If you do, chances are you're probably not going to be profitable. We have to remember that we've got to take care of those cows before they're going to take care of us in a business setting. They're much like what we talk about employees. But if you notice this particular cow, you can see she's basically a walking skeleton with a hide tied over it. You can see every bone in her body more or less anyway, no fat whatsoever, and dang little muscle as she's pulling the fat out of her muscle to be able to survive too. And if an old cow that's a 1 or a 2 was to actually read the textbook, most of them won't hardly be able to get up, and they won't be able to, and most of them won't breed either. They're like I say, they don't have enough fat cover to be able to keep their hormonal status in sync to where they can cycle and be able to breed. And so they won't be able to breed most generally anyway. And then we've got this 9 condition score cow over here that's the exact opposite. She's a walking tub of lard. If you look at her, you see fat everywhere. And like I said, we don't want to be on either one of these extremes because of a lot of reasons. And chances are, like, this cow's not going to get bred either because she's too fat. And if she does, we're going to have trouble pulling a calf out of her as well, because this one here, she's not going to have the energy, and this one, and the body condition score 9 cow isn't going to have the energy because of all the extra fat that she has to carry around. And you think about how much all this fat pushing outward, why it's also pushing inward on that birth canal, making it more difficult for you to get a calf to pass through as well. And then a cow that's this fat's gonna have a lot of this udder space that's filled up with fat rather than milk, and so she's not going to milk very well for you either. And so we don't want to be on either one of these extremes. Here's kind of where we really want to be. The 5 is kind of the bottom, is what we would kind of consider toward the bottom end of our ideal range there anyway. And I hope most of you have cows right now coming out of winter that are kind of looking like this, or slightly thinner anyway. And as I said earlier, you might see just a faint outline of the last rib or two on a body condition score 5 cow as she was kind of ganned up from being shut up for the day or something like that. She doesn't have any extra fat up here in her brisket, and you can see where her hip bones are here, but they aren't sticking out like a thin old dairy cow either. And so, like I say, this is kind of what we like to see for a cow in her working clothes here. And then the other side of that equation is the 7 condition score over here that's on the right hand, this nice, pretty big black cow. And that's kind of the top end of where we really want to be too. If we go to getting much above that 7 score there, why we can start seeing a little bit of decline in the reproductive efficiency. And again, as we talked about a minute ago, that fat filling into the udder can start being a little bit of an issue as well anyway. But I tend to like to to have my cows be a little bit on the fleshier side going into winter, because that extra fat cover they've got on, and that's kind of God's gift to us and a way to store energy to get us through those leaner times that we talked about. And so if they look more like this going into winter, and they're more apt to look to not get below the 5 condition score coming out of winter then anyway. And so, like I say, we want to try and maintain that range as best as what we possibly can there anyway. For our heifers, we'd like to see them be more in that 6s and low 7s range than the 5s, even for that matter, at calving, just simply because of what we talked about earlier about them having to pull reserves out for and the growth that's going on in higher energy requirements because of that as well. Okay, so let's focus on the manure here just a little bit more. Anyway, these pictures here actually came from some Arkansas workers, where they came from, University of Arkansas. On the left side over here, we've got a nice round kind of clean. We've got 15% protein and not quite 30% on the fiber, which come out to about 53.5% TDN there anyway. So that's kind of what we're trying to shoot for there, is a nice round consistency. And as I said earlier, when we see these really tight, kind of piled up type of manure piles, which got all these rings in them, that's an indicator of decreased protein, and notice our fiber content's a little bit higher here as well. That stuff is not passing through the animal as quickly. They can't digest it near as well because of the added fiber content in it, and then there's not enough energy there to feed the microbes either on that one, or protein rather, excuse me, to feed the microbes anyway and keep them going. So we got to kind of keep that going. And then on this far right one over here, we're kind of bouncing on iffy territory there from a protein standpoint. But on the energy side, we're really low there anyway. That's some pretty high fiber type of stuff there. And so that manure is still stacking up a little bit on us, but since we're a little bit better on the protein side of things, why it isn't looking quite as bad as what the one in the middle did. So here's what I generally tell folks, and when we look at manure, if you call this manureology or poopology, if you want to, I guess, we want to see more pancakes than wedding cakes out there. Basically, we want to have this nice round flat consistency, and I recognize that the moisture content of the feed stuff that they're going into can dictate what happens with that a little bit. It's more apt to pile up if a little bit and get a little bit thicker when we're on hay than what it is when we're on really green grass. But still, we want this to be kind of nice and flat and consistent anyway. If you go to seeing these manure piles stack up like this, why that's telling us that we need to look a little bit closer at the nutritional plate of our animals and what we're actually feeding them there. Anyway, if any of you are real tech savvy and use your phones an awful lot, Texas A&M has an app you can download to put on your phone called the Cow Poop Analyzer, where they've got pictures of various manure scores like what we looked at on this slide here anyway, to where you can kind of look and compare your manure pile with what their lab says that a certain energy content and protein content are of those particular manure piles, and kind of give you an idea how you're getting along there. And you can take pictures and store all that, but I think probably most of you have sense enough that you can look and figure out what we're looking for there anyway. So let's talk a little bit about nutritional implications here. From basically, we're talking about if we don't meet those animals' needs, what's going to happen to us on the backside. And ultimately, we're going to affect reproduction, and we can affect animal health, not only for that cow, but certainly for the calf. It's going to affect how that calf performs for the rest of its life force as well. And then at the end of the day, we've got to think about this as a business. And if we don't take care of those cows, why we're not going to make as much money off of the cows that we sell off them either there anyway. And so we're going to talk about profitability as a whole there. Okay, so this is actually from some work that was done in Florida several years ago anyway, where they took cows that were in various body condition scores, and then they just kind of looked at how many of them they could get bred in a 60-day calving season, how many of them got bred in the first cycle of that 60-day calving season, and so on and so forth there anyway. And so as you notice, when we go to getting even the body condition score for cows over a 60-day breeding season, why we get several of those bred. We get 90% of those bred anyway, which is pretty good, to be honest with you anyway still. And so we can get them, as I said earlier, if we get those cows that get down kind of a little bit below that 5, if we can get them to bounce back up pretty quick around breeding time, well, we can still get them get them to get bred to where they'll calve in a fairly short calving window there for us. But where we really lag behind in this area right in here is those that we can get bred in the first cycle, the first 21 days of that calving season, which is really, when we think about things, we want to have as consistent of a calf crop as we possibly can for a couple of reasons. First, when we think about marketing, what sells best? Large lots of calves that are almost identical. If you're selling at a sale barn, a feeder calf market somewhere, why they want to be able to have put together a good set of consistent calves. And so if we can get more of those bred early, why that's gonna do that for us rather than stringing our calving season out over several months. And besides that, why we think about from a reproductive standpoint, those heifers that are born early in the calving season tend to be ones that will calve early in the calving season as cows themselves, and will stay in the herd for more years too. Anyway, so basically, we need to be selecting for those that are gonna calve in the first cycle of the breeding season, because they'll tend to be more fertile over the long haul and make us more money over the course of their life anyway. And so we've got to think about that, and that's where our management and kind of getting those cows set up to where they're in proper condition at the start of the breeding season will help us out with that. Okay, let's take that one step further and look at milk production here. So this comes from from Nebraska work actually, but they had a set of cows. They started out in a body condition score of 4, which is kind of, again, that's really thinner than what we would really like to have there. And then they tried to add condition to those cows over time, basically, anyways, is what they did there. And if you notice why those that we didn't try to change the score on, why they actually lost a little bit of condition. Those that we tried to put a body condition score on, the average on them was about a half a condition score. And those that we were trying to get up to putting 1 to 2, so in that 5 to 6 range there anyway, why they got closer to being in the middle there at a 1 and 1.2, so a condition score and a quarter there basically anyway. And so if you look at their overall milk production there anyway, why taking better care of those cows made them produce more milk for us. And what do you think that means? That means that our calf's going to grow better at the end of the day, doesn't it? So kind of keep that in mind as well. All right, so let's get back to, we talked about how nutrition is the glue that holds the puzzle together earlier on. Why, let's look at the whole puzzle here for just a second and see what we've got. So again, this is a different Nebraska study that this comes from about 15 years ago now, and to be honest with you. So your numbers for weaning weights and the like may be a little bit different, but in all honesty, when we look at national averages, they really haven't changed all that much for the actual average weaning weight across the nation anyway. So for this particular study, they had cows that they broke down into 3, 4, 5, and 6 body condition scores, because they didn't go any lower than that because there really wasn't a whole lot of point. And then the same, they didn't get any heavier than a 6, because again, that kind of gets us up to that tipping point almost there anyway. So if you look at these cows that were kept in a body condition score of 3, 43% of those got bred. Now, is that going to be a profitable operation? Usually if I'm in a face-to-face crowd, there's a teacher or two, and I'll ask them what would happen if their students got a 43% in their class anyway. Well, that's essentially what we're doing right there. We've got a failing herd here. If only 43% of those cows actually became pregnant for us to start with. Then we look at the calving interval, 414 days between calves. So what's our magical target? 365 days. We want them to calve the same day every year of their productive life for us, basically anyway. And so we're well beyond that 365-day ideal calving interval to get 43% of them. So to be able to fail still, we're well beyond average on, or we're well beyond where we want to be on the calving interval there. Then if we look at the calf gains here for just a second, we've got 1.6 pound per day gain on those calves anyway, which equated out to a 375 pound calf at weaning. Now, I think probably most of you, even thinking back 15 years ago, would say that a 375 pound weaning average for your herd was not acceptable anyway. And so that kind of tells us where we're looking for. Now let's look down here at the nitty gritty, the dollars per cow exposed. So basically, how they figured this is they take the check that you got from the sale barn divided by the number of cows that were in that particular herd there anyway. And so $214 per cow exposed is what they came up with there. Anyway, even back then, that wasn't enough to cover the carrying cost of those cows, and so you lost money on them. Now let's get down here and look at the other side of the equation here, our 5 and 6 conditions for cows down here at the bottom. Why? Here we're one side or the other, 90% pregnancy rate. So we went from a failing grade to an A in class here, basically anyway, just simply by taking better care of those cows. We got down here, we're a 364-day average calving interval, right on target with our calving the same day every year there, and 1.85 pound a day gain there anyway. So basically a quarter pound gain more essentially on each day on those calves, amounted to 514 pound calf at weaning. Now you think back 15 years ago, and that was pretty acceptable, for a 205-day weaning weight at that point. And again, it's still pretty close to average if we look at the national herd today, even for that matter. When we look at the dollars per cow exposed number down here, $580 per cow exposed for that body condition score 6 cows, opposed to the $214 per cow exposed for the 3 condition score. So better than 2.5 times the return off of those cows simply by taking care of them there. And so that tells you right there that it's the right thing to do for not only for your cows, but for you as well, to take better care of them from a nutritional standpoint. And I promise you that both my wife and my banker like $580 per cow a whole lot better than they like $214 per cow when we get that check back anyway. And you guys would all say the same thing. So let's talk about some health issues that we need to think about here briefly. The first one is dystocia. We already kind of talked about that a little bit, how those cows that are thin at calving, or they're more apt to have trouble with calving because of the fact that they don't have energy to go along with that. And there's been a lot of studies that have been done about fetal programming and colostrum quality and the like. A lot of them out of Nebraska, and actually we have one PhD on campus, Allison Meyer, who's been doing quite a bit of work over the last several years on the milk quality and the like anyway, and fetal programming studies and the like here at the University of Missouri as well. But anyway, one thing that holds true is all these studies show that if that cow isn't taken care of nutritionally, why, she's not going to pass on the immunity to her calf through colostrum. The quality and quantity both of that colostrum are going to be reduced, which is going to increase the likelihood of that calf getting sick and later on in life and just flat not producing for us. And they've taken this all the way through to the feed lot and on the rail, even for that matter, and seen a pretty substantial reduction in the way that those animals gain and how they lay in fat in the muscle, the marbling that we all like to talk about so much as well there anyway. So again, you're not affecting only yourself, you're affecting the next two guys in the chain there, the feedlot and the packer along with that anyway. And so kind of keep that in mind. All right, now we don't have a lot of time to really focus a whole lot on supplementation, but I wanted to kind of talk about the principles here for you a little bit. The first thing we've got to do is we've got to have an idea of where we are. And what do I mean by that? Again, that comes back down to that ration balancing we talked about in the beginning there, knowing what our cows' requirements are, and then knowing what we've got as far as feedstuffs, and then trying to figure out how to fill those gaps between what our cows need and what they've got in the way of our grass and hay that we've got to feed them anyway. And so what does that take? Ideally, we'd have a forage test in front of us to be able to tell us just exactly where we are. Now, I told you a few of those kind of cheat and tricks to give you an idea of how you're doing with the body condition and the manure evaluation. But again, to really get down to the nuts and bolts of it, it sure is nice to have a forage test in front of us to be able to calculate that out better anyway. Another thing that we can do that can really prove helpful, and particularly with feed costs as high as what they are now, and certainly looking like they're going to get higher over the next couple of months on top of that anyway, is doing a little bit of sorting and splitting those cows out in the herds there anyway. The first two splits that I would recommend you do, and we talked about the heifers already, how we like to keep those heifers in a group of their own so we can take a little bit better care of them. And then the other big one is spring calving cows versus fall calving cows. If we can split those two herds up, and I'll show you in a few slides, their nutritional requirements are, for all practical purposes, inverse of one another. When when a spring calving cow's at peak lactation, the peak of her nutritional requirements, that fall calving cow is almost at the bottom of her nutritional requirements anyway there. And so there's really not much sense in supplementing that fall calving cow when the spring calving cow is the one that really needs it and she doesn't. And so if we can kind of cut that back on the number of mouths that we're putting the supplement to, why we could potentially cut our feed cost down quite a little bit there anyway. And then beyond that, these are the gravy. If you've got a lot of ways to sort cows, a lot of different pastures to be able to move them to and the like, if you can sort those fatter cows that really don't need it, that can burn some of that energy off their back, from the thinner cows that do need a little bit of help, why again you can cut back on supplement because you're not feeding those fatter cows a supplement. And then the same with the older cows versus the younger cows. It takes, as those cows age, why they reach a point where it takes more energy to keep them going as well anyway. And so if we can keep those older cows separated away from the younger, more running age type of cows, why we might not need to put as much but the bottom line is target that supplement to the animals that need it most. And when it comes to fertilizer, why we do a pretty good job of that when we take care of our ground and what we give to them, but we don't always split things up and evaluate our cow herd quite as closely there anyway. And that's one of those things where our management can really affect things anyway. And beyond that, I will show you here, we've got a couple of different options. And these lip tubs here, everybody's familiar with them. We put a lot of protein. Those are a lot of protein is what they are in those. And remember what we said earlier about protein, that we tend to be okay, maybe not exactly where we need to be, but close to it on protein anyway. And so you're really buying a lot of convenience with these. And there are times when that might, although it's more expensive, why it might be the way to go for your individual operation. But we've really got to think about what we're buying when we buy those anyway. So we can mix you up a commodity mix, and it's going to have things like distillers grains and soy hulls, like what you see in it being held in my hands in the pictures up here, and even corn can go into those mixes anyway too. But it really kind of comes down to finding the least cost option for what you need to build that supplement out of there. Okay, so beyond that, while we're talking about supplementation, we talked about on the cow side of things. One thing you might think about, particularly right now, and again, feed costs are pretty darn high right now, and I notice I put a pencil to it in all capital letters at the bottom down there. That's the number one thing to think about with creep feed. But the thing to think about, right now where we're a little bit deficient on forage, why if you can make it pencil out, why you might want to think about putting a little bit of creep feed to those fall-born cows here for the last 60 days or so before we wean them anyway. And that could help. That could put some fairly efficient gain onto those calves for you there, and take a little bit of pressure off of your grass too. One thing that a lot of people will tell you that you take pressure off of the cow when you creep feed because the calf doesn't consume as much milk. Well, that's not true. The calf will still likely consume as much milk, but they won't consume as much forage. They won't be picking at the grass and the hay quite as much anyway. They'll go to the feed source first, most generally anyway. And so again, that's one of those things that could potentially work for you, but you really got to pay. And you'll find, even in the literature, you'll find ranges all the way from 5-to-1 to 30-to-1 on the feed to gain. Now, if you can get them to gain on a 5-to-1 ratio, meaning 5 pound of feed to a pound of gain, why chances are you probably can make it come out. But if you're at 30-to-1, why there's no way you can make that come out for you. I promise you, if it takes 30 pounds of feed to put a pound of gain on, why that's not going to be profitable if you're having to buy that 30 pounds. So keep that in mind. And again, I said this in the beginning, take all this with a grain of salt, and we'll put a pencil to it for your individual situation there and see how things work out. So I alluded to this a little bit earlier on, but we need to ask ourselves, when do we calve? When do we want to calve anyway? And there's a lot of factors that go into that really. And of course, beyond calving, why we've got to think about the calving season conditions with the weather, why we've got to think about the breeding season as well anyway. And the primary factor that I get concerned about with the breeding season is the heat a lot of times with when we think about spring calving cows. And you will read a lot in the popular press about needing to calve more in sync with nature, and how we need to push our spring calving windows more back into where we don't even start until late in April. And for the western states, that works out pretty well. But you got to think back to what our primary forage is in Southwest Missouri. It's Kentucky 31 fescue. And we know that as that fescue goes to getting more mature and in that late spring time frame there, when we would be calving and trying to get those animals bred back, why we know that the fescue, the endophyte in the fescue, the ergovaline, it's at its peak in that point and causes a lot of heat stress, which can lead to drastic reductions in our breeding percentages there anyway. And so I don't particularly think that that's a really a smart option for us for a lot of our animals. You know, if you've got a herd that you have developed over the course of decades that is very tolerant of fescue, you might make that work for you, but not everybody's going to be able to make that work for them in Southwest Missouri on our fescue there anyway. On the flip side of that, we've got to think about calving season conditions, and again, that tends to be more of a problem for us with our spring calving cows or late winter. And most of you probably remember what it was like last February, you know, just a little over a year ago now, when a lot of folks were having calves born in that weather where we had quite a bit of snow on the ground and had 20 below temperatures. And I don't think we got above a high of about 25 for about 3 weeks there in February. Even it was really hard on those animals in there. And so we kind of take that into consideration there at the same time anyway. So, and then I put this one in here, your schedule and timing. Now, there may be a crop farmer or two in this bunch. And so you got to think about, particularly with the calving window there, when you really have to watch things closely, well, you don't want to set that up to where you're going to be off in the fields. And if you work a job, why that can come into play. You got to think about when your busy times are and kind of plan around that a little bit too, to where you can spend more time keeping a closer eye on those cows at calving time there. And then lastly, we've got to think about our marketing methods there anyway. And one thing that I will tell you, and I've got a slide about that here in just a few too as well, that it seems like there are more right times to sell a fall-born calf than there are right times to sell a spring-born calf. And a lot of that comes down to the fact that when we look at national averages again, why about 75% of the cows that are in the United States are spring calving cows. So we are very fortunate around here where we can make that fall calving situation work for us because our winters are mild enough and we have the capability of most years being able to stockpile away enough feed to make that really balance out really well for us. And so I would encourage you to kind of think about switching to fall calving as an option for you there. Okay, so this chart here, this is the energy requirements of a spring calving cow versus a fall calving cow. And if you remember one of the first slides where we talked about this briefly in here anyway, but if you look, the green line here, that's basically the grass growth curve for our cool season grasses there anyway. We start out with not a whole awful lot quantity or quality wise here early on, but then we get up here into the middle of spring, the heart of the quality and growth period too, for that matter anyway. Why, and then we start tapering off through the summer months here because as we get hotter, why our cool season grasses can't grow, and then as we start cooling off there through the fall months, why that grass really starts to come on again there anyway. And so if we look at the red bar here, our fall calving cows versus the white bar, our spring calving cows here, what do we see when we compare that to the grass? If we look at our grass quality here in relation to what our fall calving cows are, they're pretty well in line with each other right there. When that fall calving cow is in the peak of her lactation, the peak of her nutritional requirements for the year, well, we've got the best quality feed of the year a lot of times right there in front of her in both quantity and quality. So that can work out really well from us from that standpoint as well. Where these spring calving cows here, unless you kind of figure out a way to change up your management a little bit and utilize some stockpile through here where she's at the peak of her nutritional requirements, why we've got quite a gap in here between our grass quality and what our actual cows require right here with these typical February calving type of cows here anyway. And so that's something that we've really got to think about there anyway. And the bottom line is develop a system that works for you. And again, that's another one of those things that I'm willing to help you with, and Patrick is too. I'm trying to figure that out as we go along. So here's kind of going back to that marketing stuff here anyway. If you think about when those spring-born calves are marketed, it's going to be somewhere here in the last quarter of the year, isn't it? You know, when we think about when the majority of those lighter weight calves like that are going to be sold. And we reach the bottom of the market typically out here in October. You'll hear a lot of cattle buyers refer to October as National Dead Calf Month, and that comes back to animal health issues and stress from weaning and the vast cycles in temperature we have between the heat of the day and the cold at night and the like anyway. And a lot of stresses come into play there, and a lot of risk that comes along with those cattle. And so the price goes down pretty drastically on those lighter weight calves in there. Where if we look at those fall-born calves that are born here in this time frame, well, they're ready to market kind of right up here in the peak of the marketing season there, where the value is the highest anyway. And so again, that kind of shows you that's another reason to be able to be thinking about going to the fall calving cows. All right, again, we don't have a lot of time to go into too much detail when we think about the AI and synchronization, but I do want you to think about what it can bring to the table for you. And first and foremost, getting involved in artificial insemination is not something that's going to work out for everybody. It takes facilities and it takes management to be able to do it. Not everybody's got the facilities and not everybody's got the time to be able to manage things properly, but it can. One of the most talked about benefits is the genetic improvement potential that you have there. By basically, if you're selecting bulls to breed your cows to that come out of the top of the industry, why you should theoretically be able to make some pretty rapid genetic improvement within your herd by doing that. And quite honestly, those of us that have been involved in artificial insemination programs over the years have seen that happen anyway. Then the other one, the one that I think really is probably the most important, is we front load that calving season where we get more of those cows to calving in that first 21 days of the calving season, like what we talked about earlier on, and how critical that is anyway to marketing and developing heifers that are going to work for us long term as well anyway. And so that's one of those things. And then I put this in here, the marketing price improvement opportunity. And you have to do the work on the marketing side and make sure that however you market those animals, that they know that they're AI sired and that they carry those top genetics within them like that anyway. But we've all seen that where all it takes is saying that those are AI bred or AI sired as they run through the ring, and you can easily bump the value by a couple of $100 on a good set of calves there anyway. And I put this in here with a question mark, cheaper than running bulls. Well, that's going to depend on your individual situation. If you're spending several dollars on some really top quality bulls, why it may not be, it probably will be cheaper. But if you're buying just run of the mill out of the sale barn bulls that are really more what we would call a cow freshener that just get the job done and get a calf on the ground, why chances are you can turn those bulls and make it work for you cheaper anyway, but you might not, but cheap isn't always going to please you either though anyway. And so keep that in mind. And really, to be honest with you, when you go to looking at the cost factors, why they tend to be pretty close and run pretty close together between running bulls. But the thing to remember is on sizable herds where you have to run more than one bull, while you could potentially cut your bull power in half by doing that and being able to get a 50 to 60% calf crop out of your AI there, you could potentially. And what does that mean? Why it means one less big mouth to feed off your feed bill for one thing, or like I say, potentially half as many big mouths to feed from the bull side of the equation there anyway. And beyond that, you can be getting these other benefits as well out of it anyway. So I would encourage you to work with the professionals as you get started through the process there anyway. It takes practice to get good at artificial insemination. You don't learn it overnight. And when we think of Missouri is pretty unique in the fact that here we sit number 2 or number 3 in the nation in beef cow numbers year in and year out. Yet our average herd size still sits in the mid 30s somewhere anyway. And so we have a lot of small operations in it, and most of the experts will tell you that it takes doing at least 30 head a year to be able to get the feel and the practice. It takes practice to be good at any sort of an art form, and that's kind of what artificial insemination is an art form anyway. And so it takes practice, and so you might be better off to hire somebody to actually do your actual breeding for you. I can teach you how to do the synchronization side of the protocols, and your AI techs, they're mostly willing to work with you and kind of work you through the process the first time as well there anyway. And so again, that's one of those things. Reach out, and Patrick and I can either help you personally, or we can send you in the right direction to get the help that you need when in getting things set up if you're interested going down that route. I wanted to finish up kind of talking about heifer development here for a little bit. One of the things that we forget about a lot of times is replacement heifers and replacing that cow herd. That accounts to about 20% of our cost, and maybe as much as 30 in some years, even for that matter anyway. And so we've got to kind of keep that in mind that there's a lot of cost that comes along with it. And for smaller operations, you may well be better off financially to buy your replacements as opposed to raising them on your own. But on the flip side of that, I understand there's a sense of pride, and certainly you know what you've got when you're keeping your own heifers back like that anyway. And so it's really a trade-off there. Do we want to go for maximum profit, or do we want to go for the feel good and having a good idea of what we've got in our genetics there and build over the lifetime there anyway? But one thing that holds true is that we've got to develop those heifers profitably, because, as I said, it takes quite a little bit of money to be able to, you've got a lot invested in those heifers. And so we want to make sure that we can make them succeed as much as what we possibly can. So this is some information that came out of USDA data, and it's a few years old now, but fairly recent still anyway. But looking at the reason that cows get called out of the herd, pregnancy status is the first one, of course, but about a third of the cows that get called is because of pregnancy status, basically being open when they should have been bred, or having abortion type of issues, that kind of thing. And then another third goes toward age, and of course we mouth those cows. Ones that have a mouth that's gonna cause them to not be an easy keeper anymore, basically is what we're looking at there anyway. And then the rest of those factors take up the other third there anyway. And so again, the pregnancy status is the one that we really look for there anyway. And so certainly keep that in mind. And one thing that we've got to think about is those cows, particularly with input costs the way they are right now, those cows we're looking at 5 calves out of those heifers before they ever recoup their cost. And so that means she's a 7-year-old before she's recouped all of her costs at that rate. So we've got to make sure that we're picking the right ones so that we don't lose money off of them over time. And I understand some of you that play the markets a little bit, you can make money off of those failures and the like anyway, and come out okay. But like, as a general rule, like I say, we need that cow 7 years old before she's paid for herself for us anyway. Okay, so this chart here kind of looks at some different aspects here anyway. We've got different feed stuff to look at there anyway, and we've got the actual this heifer that we're trying to develop nutritional requirements to get. We need to try and shoot for around a pound and a half gain per day on those between weaning and breeding seasons, what we're kind of trying to shoot for there anyway. And to do that, why we need to have about a 65% TDN is what we're shooting for, and that's what this green dash line here is anyway. So down here we've got typical old Southwest Missouri, Kentucky 31 fescue hay that's going to be, and to be honest with you, I'd consider this being on the better side of average at 55%. So we've got 10% energy deficiency there that we've got to overcome from the hay if we're trying to do that on our own and get the gains that we like out of it anyway. And then on the other side of that equation, we've got doing it on feed up here on the top, where we're going to be somewhere, excuse me, 80 to 90% TDN up there. If you look, we can get by with stockpile fescue for a whole lot of that development period. We get out here toward the end, and we might need to look at things anyway. But again, that stockpile fescue can be a pretty good tool for us for putting some cheap gain on our animals. Okay, so probably some of you have heard this debate about the target weights, and others of you may not anyway. But basically, there's kind of two camps when we think about trying at what percentage of mature weight we need to have our heifers when we breed them for the first time. The 55%, the 55% emphasis anyway, that will put you in more emphasis on actually truly finding those heifers that are more reproductively more fertile, the ones that are more apt to get bred and meet your environment a little bit better. Whereas if we try and focus on that 65% of the side, we'll get more of them bred, but we'll have more cost in them as well anyway there. And so really, it's going to depend a little bit on your marketing. If you've got a market for value-added bred heifers, why you might want to put a little bit more feed to them and get more of them bred than what you might at the 55%. But ironically, a lot of the research lately has showed that there isn't a heck of a lot of difference between those that are that are managed to be at 55% at breeding, and those that are at 65% at breeding anyway. And so again, that's kind of a little bit of a preference thing and thinking about, but we want to pick those that are going to be fertile for us is what we want to look at there anyway. So, all right, I mentioned this a little bit ago. We've got 200 days to put 300 pounds of gain on them when we think about the weaning to breeding span there anyway, which comes to 1.5 pounds a day of gain. So when we talk about picking those heifers, like I said earlier on, why we want to do our best to pick the best that are out there for us. And so the first thing we can do is we can get rid of ones that are obvious outliers that just flat won't work for us early on in the equation, so we don't have that extra cost in them. And some of those we can pick out at weaning and take them out of the potential breeding herd anyway. And then one of the cornerstones of our Show Me Select Heifer development program is the pre-breeding exam, and that's another time where we can kind of look and get a better idea of and select and get rid of some of those heifers that just aren't going to work for us. And two of the fundamental portions of that exam are the pelvic measurements, and basically what we do, we take this big set of calipers here, a pelvimeter it's called anyway, and we measure and we get the pelvic area of those animals. And when we think about our pre-breeding exams, why we want to have those heifers be about 150 centimeters squared, or a minimum of 150 centimeters squared when we do this pre-breeding exam 30 to 45 days ahead of when we start the breeding season here anyway. And why does that matter? Because that heifer has to be big enough we want her to be able to have that calf on her own, and that's kind of what researchers told us is a bare bones minimum for most management scenarios to be able to, for that heifer to be able to successfully have that calf on her own. The other critical part of the pre-breeding exam is the reproductive tract score, where you feel of the reproductive tract and determine how far along they are in their puberty status there. And we use a 1 to 5 scoring system, where a 1 is infantile, basically no tone, very little chance of her getting bred, when we start the breeding season 30 days or so later anyway. And a 5 is one that's basically cycling and in heat that day for you. And so we want to have as many as possible of those heifers be a 3 or higher on that 5-point scale there when we do these pre-breeding exams. And really, I've got to the point with a lot of the herds that I work with where if they're a 1 or 2, they just call them at this point here anyway, and don't give them the chance anyway, because they're at a significant decreased likelihood of getting bred through a managed breeding season there. Okay, I wanted to focus on kind of beyond that breeding season here just a little bit. This is some good information that you might want to take home, just kind of management wise for the first 45 days or so after that cow is bred, whether it be a cow or a heifer, either one here anyway. The first 3 days are pretty susceptible to this. We don't want to put a whole lot of stress on those animals in the first 3 days, because if we get them hot while they're at a significantly increased likelihood of an early embryonic death there, where basically we're killing that baby that's being formed there, that embryo, because of the heat stress that goes along with it. And we want to try and keep those from being stressed from a nutritional standpoint and losing too much weight that first week or so afterwards too. And the last one here is the one that's probably the most common, and the one that we think about furthest out is the shipping stresses that excuse me, that come into play there anyway. So this is some data that came out of the Dakotas actually here anyway, where they looked at moving those heifers and how that affected their pregnancy rate, or their likelihood or their possibility of aborting because of the transportation anyway. So if we can move those heifers in the first 4 days after artificial insemination, why we showed that basically we still get 75% of them to stay pregnant to that synchronization, and 95% of them over the managed breeding season as well there anyway. We move in here, we get into this window here anyway, between about day 7 or 8 and out to really even up to 45 days, to be honest with you here anyway. And this is pretty iffy territory. We want to try and kind of leave those heifers alone and not move them around, get them jostled too much in that window there anyway. But beyond 45 days, and certainly beyond 60, why it becomes more safe to ship them again there anyway. All right, so this is kind of tying things together for the end of the day here. What I think you need to be shooting for, and what a lot of the research would tell you as well that you need to be shooting for when we think about about heifers to keep back and how we expect our cows to herd, our cow herd to work for us as well there anyway. We want these heifers to calf by the time they're 24 months of age on average for the first time there. Anyway, that's what we need to manage to where they're ready to calve at 24 months of age is what we want to try and shoot for. There on them. When we think about our mature cow herd, we want those cows to calve every 365 days for us and have an adequate calf for us, one that we consider adequate at weaning to go along with that there anyway. If they don't do that, they're not doing their job for us, and we could send them to go be somebody else's employee is the way I generally explain that to folks anyway. And obviously, if you have livestock, you're going to have trouble from time to time, but we don't like to have to pull calves and assist with calving if we can keep from it anyway. And so certainly keep that in mind there as well. And this one right here, cows must provide sufficient resources to the calf to reach its genetic potential. You know, we're talking about milk production right there, kind of what we're focusing on there. And that cow also has to have that genetic potential herself as well there anyway. And that kind of comes into play here with a calf that can genetically perform. Cow must maintain body condition on your conditions anyway. And basically, you know, that goes down to selecting those that are going to work in your environment there. And the last one that I put on here is we don't want crazy cows. And crazy means different things to different people, but none of us are getting any younger. And when we think about the average age of the farmers and ranchers across the nation being up toward 60 years of age now anyway, why we've got to think about docility. And so that's something that needs to be really considered for us as well anyway, and get rid of those that are not easy for us to work with. And that's all I've got for you for the night anyway. If anybody's got some questions that they'd like to go over, why Patrick and I are here, and we'll certainly answer them for you.
So Andy, there was a question, and I'll let you answer. Who can do a forage? So the question was, who can do a forage test? So you might elaborate.
So, basically, you can go to any extension office and get a hay probe to test your hay. And that's the hay is the one that we really focus on more than the standing pasture, which it's just as important, but we tend to not be as deficient on standing pasture as what we are on stored forages anyway. You can go to your extension office and get that hay probe, or if you want to do standing forage test, you take clippings, random clippings from around the field anyway, and we'll help you out with that. Generally speaking, we send our samples to custom labs down at Monetta, so we send them to mostly because they're right here in our backyard and close to home, and so the turnaround time is relatively quick with it anyway. And so, but like I say, it's a pretty simple process. And Patrick and I and most any livestock or agronomy specialist across Southwest Missouri with extension will have the capability to help you out with that process through the first time. And so I'd encourage you to reach out to your extension center, your local extension center, and to get the ball rolling anyway. And like I say, if that doesn't work for you, well, get a hold of Patrick or I, whichever one will be closer to you, and we'll certainly help you out on a case-by-case basis with that anyway, and get you on the right direction. Some feed dealers have hay probes, and we'll work with you on that too, particularly if you're buying feed from them. They'll help you, and might even absorb a little bit of the cost on the test for you, even on some of that, even for that matter. But I wouldn't hold my breath for that, but historically there have been some that have done that at least anyway.
So Andy, there was another question about sex semen, and have you worked with Resync? Is that a sync program?
Let me see if I can read the question here.
Yeah, well,
so the sex semen deal, you are going to get a reduction in in AI conception with sex semen for certain anyway. Now there's Dr. Thomas is doing quite a bit of work with sex semen, and he's trying to do his best to fine tune a protocol to certainly close down that gap between what conventional semen and sex semen will there anyway. I would say that probably it's going to depend on your individual situation whether it's something that you want to work with or not there anyway. If you need to build a cow herd and you need to work on quality, well, you could get some heifer sex semen certainly anyway. And there are some ABS has a new product out there that I know now that the accuracy of the sex sorting isn't quite as high on anyway, and they're they're finding a little bit better conception rates with it than some of the other more processed product anyway. But again, you lose a little bit of accuracy along with that anyway. And then on the side of the resync, I assume you're meaning setting those cows up for the ones that we don't get bred on the first cycle, setting them up for cycling again anyway. And there are a couple of different ways to go about that anyway. And again, that's another one of those things. Dr. Thomas has been kind of working on that a little bit as well anyway. And we can talk about that more on a case-by-case basis later on there anyway. Any other questions about that?
I don't see any other questions in the chat.
Okay. Like I say, the sex semen deal, I will say, I mean, the technology is there that it does work, but you're going to see a reduction in conception rates with it, and the semen costs more because of the extra processing and shipping that goes into it too. Most of that has to go to Texas to the lab down there to be sorted, and then winds up coming back up here again. And so if there's not a lot of extra shipping costs that are involved with sex sorting as well there anyway. And so, like I say, I mean, if you're in a situation where you're trying to build a good set of heifers to make a cow herd out of, why it might work for you. And on the flip side of that, if you're wanting to develop a lot of bulls for sale, if you're in a seed stock business, that might be something that you want to think about there too. But it's not going to be something that's going to be something that just everybody's going to want to jump on at this point. But I think with time we'll get things figured out closer that way, where it'll be a better deal long term. But
I don't see any more questions. Thanks, Andy, for giving that presentation tonight. With that, I think we'll call it an evening. We'll be back, I believe, on the 14th, next Monday night, and we're going to cover cattle grazing management. Pat, the first night, talked a lot about forages and pasture management and things like that. And I'll be going into more of the grazing management and short-term things as well as long-term things that we can do from a grazing management standpoint. And so from a cattle grazing management standpoint. So with that, thank you all for being on tonight. And like I said, again, this is recorded, so I'll hopefully get that converted to YouTube link and sent out tomorrow. So with that, thanks, Andy, and thanks for everybody being on, and we'll see you next week, hopefully.